The autumn breeze swept through the bustling streets of New York as Lynn walked out of her medical school, her heart lighter than air. She had just aced her final exams and couldn't wait to share the news with Ryan, her boyfriend of 2 years. The same Ryan Sterling who had captured her heart when they bumped into each other at a small coffee shop, spilling hot chocolate all over her second-hand textbooks. That day, instead of being annoyed, he had insisted on replacing her books and stayed to chat. Despite being one of the city's most eligible bachelors and the heir to Sterling Industries, Ryan had fallen for her genuine smile and passionate dreams of becoming a doctor who would help children from underprivileged backgrounds. Lynn checked her phone, smiling at his message asking her to meet at his office. She had even bigger news to share. She'd been feeling unwell lately, and a quick visit to her college medical center had confirmed her suspicions. They were going to have a baby. Her hand instinctively went to her still flat stomach as she hailed a taxi. The Sterling Industries building towered over the city like a glass giant. Lynn knew every security guard by name, exchanging warm greetings as she made her way to the top floor. But today, something felt different. The receptionist wouldn't meet her eyes, and Ryan's secretary nervously fidgeted with her papers. "Mr. Sterling is waiting for you," the secretary mumbled, gesturing to the heavy wooden doors. Lynn stepped into the familiar office, her smile fading as she saw Ryan standing by the window, his back rigid and tense. Next to him sat his mother, Mrs. Sterling, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against a folder on her lap. "Ryan." Lynn's voice came out smaller than she intended. He turned, and Lynn's heart stopped. His usually warm brown eyes were cold, distant. "We need to talk." Mrs. Sterling smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She opened the folder and spread several photographs across Ryan's desk. "Care to explain these, dear?" Lynn stepped closer, confusion turning to horror as she saw photos of herself meeting with different men, all of them looking suspiciously intimate. These are fake. Ryan, you know these aren't real." "Save it," he cut her off. "I've seen the bank statements too. How long have you been selling information about Sterling Industries to our competitors?" Lynn felt the room spin. "What? No. Ryan, those men were patients' fathers from my pediatric rotation. You can check with the hospital." "Enough." His voice cracked like thunder. "I trusted you, Lynn. I thought you were different. But you're just like all the others, after my money, my position." Tears streamed down Lynn's face as she realized what was happening. 2 years of love and trust were crumbling before her eyes, orchestrated by a woman who had never approved of her son dating someone from a middle-class background. "I have a contract signing in Shanghai next week," Ryan continued, his voice now eerily calm. "When I return, I'll be announcing my engagement to Mei Wan. Her family's connections will be valuable for Sterling Industries' expansion into Asia." Lynn's hand moved protectively to her stomach. "The baby, their baby," she had to tell him. But as she opened her mouth, Mrs. Sterling stood up, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "Security will escort you out," she said smoothly. "And dear, if you try to make any trouble, remember that no hospital will hire a doctor with a record of corporate espionage." The threat hung in the air like poison. Lynn looked at Ryan one last time, hoping to see a glimmer of the man she loved, but he had already turned back to the window. Her future, their future, shattered into a million pieces. As security led her through the lobby, Lynn held her head high despite her tears. Passers-by might have seen just another drama in the corporate world, but they didn't know she was walking away with the most precious secret of all. That night, as she packed her bags in her tiny apartment, Lynn made a decision. She would leave New York, not just for herself, but for her unborn child. She had an offer for a medical residency in a small coastal town in California. It wasn't prestigious like her current program, but it was far away from the Sterlings and their power. As her train pulled out of Grand Central Station the next morning, Lynn watched the city skyline fade away. Her hand rested on her stomach, and for the first time that day, she smiled through her tears. "Don't worry, little one," she whispered. "We're going to be just fine." What she didn't know then was that she wasn't carrying just one miracle, but 4. And someday, these 4 little miracles would turn her world, and Ryan Sterling's, upside down once again. The small coastal town of Pine Harbor welcomed Lynn with open arms. Her tiny apartment above the local bookstore became home, and the salty ocean breeze helped ease her morning sickness. But nothing could have prepared her for the shock during her first ultrasound. 1, 2, 3, and 4 heartbeats, the technician counted, her eyes widening. "Congratulations, Dr. Chen, you're carrying quadruplets." Lin's world tilted on its axis. 4 babies? She'd been preparing herself for 1, but 4? That night, she sat on her small balcony, watching the sunset over the Pacific. "Well, little ones," she whispered, rubbing her growing belly, "looks like you're already full of surprises." The next months tested every ounce of her strength. Her medical colleagues rallied around her, adjusting her residency schedule as her belly grew impossibly large. Mrs. Rodriguez, the bookstore owner downstairs, kept her supplied with homemade soup and motherly advice. The whole town seemed to adopt the young doctor expecting 4 babies. At 7 months, Lin was put on bed rest. She used the time to prepare, reading every book she could find on multiple births. Her tiny apartment slowly filled with 4 of everything: cribs, car seats, tiny onesies. The local mothers organized a massive baby shower, and even the grumpy old fisherman down the street brought her a handmade mobile with 4 little boats. The babies arrived on a stormy spring morning, 6 weeks early but fighting fit. Just like their mama, the nurses said. 3 boys and a girl, each perfect in their own way. Lin named her sons Daniel, Michael, and Thomas, and her daughter Rose. As she held them for the first time, exhausted but overjoyed, she saw pieces of Ryan in each of their faces, but they were entirely their own people. The early days were a blur of feedings, diaper changes, and precious little sleep. Lin learned to nurse 2 babies at once while bottle feeding another and singing to the 4th. Her apartment became a carefully orchestrated symphony of baby care, with 4 different colored sticky notes to track each baby's schedule. Mrs. Rodriguez proved to be a godsend, helping during her breaks from the bookstore. "My mother raised 3 of us in a tiny house in Mexico," she'd say, expertly burping Thomas while rocking Rose. "You're doing amazing, mija." As the babies grew, their personalities emerged. Daniel was the serious one, studying everything with intense concentration. Michael never stopped moving, rolling over first and keeping his siblings entertained. Thomas was the peacemaker, always ready with a toothless smile. And Rose, the youngest by 2 minutes, had her father's determined chin and her mother's gentle heart. Lin returned to her residency when the babies were 6 months old, thanks to a wonderful daycare center that gave her a discount for bulk enrollment. She specialized in pediatrics, and her unique experience with multiples made her especially popular with worried parents. The quadruplets hit their milestones together, but in their own ways. Their first words came within days of each other. Daniel said book, Michael managed go, Thomas chirped mama, and Rose surprised everyone with star. Their first steps turned the apartment into a toddler racetrack, with Lin and Mrs. Rodriguez running interference to prevent crashes. By their 5th birthday, the quads were the heart and soul of Pine Harbor. Daniel was already reading chapter books, explaining the stories to his siblings. Michael joined every sports program available, his energy finally finding proper outlets. Thomas showed remarkable talent with the toy piano a patient had given Lin, and Rose spent hours building elaborate structures with her blocks. Lin watched them play in the park one afternoon, their dark hair shining in the sunlight. A young mother with twins sat down beside her. "I don't know how you do it with 4, she said, shaking her head in amazement. Lin smiled, remembering the heartbroken girl who'd arrived in Pine Harbor 5 years ago. "They're my strength," she replied simply. "Every challenge makes us stronger." Her private practice was thriving, word spreading about the caring doctor who could handle any childhood crisis. Medical journals were starting to notice her research on multiple birth development. Life was good, full, and complete. Or so she thought, until the day a familiar name appeared on her clinic's acquisition offer: Sterling Industries. The papers listed Ryan Sterling himself as the point of contact for negotiations. That evening, Lin watched her 4 miracles doing their homework at the kitchen table. Daniel was helping Thomas with math, while Michael fidgeted and Rose drew detailed pictures in her notebook. They were the spitting image of their father at that age, though they didn't know it. "Mama," Rose called out, holding up her drawing of their family, 5 stick figures holding hands. Look what I made." Lynn hugged her daughter close, breathing in the scent of apple shampoo and crayons. Soon she knew their peaceful life would change forever. But looking at her children's happy faces, she knew they were strong enough to handle whatever came next. After all, they were Chen Sterlings, even if they didn't know it yet. And Chen Sterlings never backed down from a challenge. Ryan Sterling stood at the window of his penthouse office, watching the sunrise over Manhattan. 5 years had changed him in ways he never expected. His arranged marriage to Mei Wang had lasted exactly 23 months before ending in a quiet divorce. The business alliance his mother had promised never materialized, leaving him with nothing but regrets and emptiness. His assistant knocked softly. "Mr. Sterling? The files for the West Coast Clinic acquisitions are ready for your review." He nodded absently, taking the folder. Sterling Industries had been expanding its healthcare division, buying promising medical practices across the country. It was his way of doing something meaningful with his fortune, though he'd never admit that thoughts of a certain medical student had inspired this direction. The file for Pine Harbor Medical Center caught his eye. The practice's innovative research on multiple births was impressive, and their community outreach programs aligned perfectly with his vision. The doctor's name made him pause. Dr. L. Chen. His heart skipped a beat, but he dismissed the thought. Chen was a common surname after all. 2 weeks later, Ryan's private jet touched down in the small coastal airport. The salty air reminded him of happier times, of weekend getaways with Lynn before everything fell apart. He pushed the memories away as his driver headed toward the clinic. The building was modest but well-maintained, with cheerful murals of sea life decorating the waiting room. Children's laughter echoed from the play area, where 4 dark-haired children were building an elaborate block tower. "Mr. Sterling?" A nurse approached. "Dr. Chen is finishing up with a patient. She'll be with you shortly." Ryan watched the children play as he waited. Something about them caught his attention. Their movements, their expressions seemed oddly familiar. The smallest boy was conducting his siblings like an orchestra as they worked, reminding Ryan of himself at that age. "All right, who's ready for lunch?" A voice called from the hallway. Ryan's world stopped spinning. Lynn stood there, her white coat crisp, but hair longer than he remembered. She froze when she saw him, color draining from her face. "Mama." The 4 children ran to her, chattering excitedly about their tower. Ryan's knees weakened as he truly looked at them, really looked at them. The same dark eyes that greeted him in childhood photos. The same dimple when they smiled. The same determined set of their little chins. "Daniel, Michael, Thomas, Rose." Lynn's voice was steady despite her pale face. "Please go with Nurse Jenny to the break room. Mama needs to talk with this gentleman." The children obediently followed the nurse, though the little girl, Rose, looked back curiously. She had Lynn's gentle expressions, but unmistakably shared Ryan's features. "They're 5, Ryan said hoarsely, once they were alone. It wasn't a question. Lynn squared her shoulders. 5 years and 3 months. "Why?" His voice cracked. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Tell you?" Lynn's laugh held no humor. "When, Ryan? When your mother was threatening to destroy my career? When you were announcing your engagement to another woman? Or maybe when security was escorting me out of the building?" Ryan sank into a waiting room chair, his world tilting on its axis. 4 of them. We have 4 children. "No." Lynn's voice was firm. Asterisk have 4 children. Children who've never missed what they didn't know they had. Children who are happy, healthy, and loved. "I have a right to know my own children," Ryan started, but Lynn cut him off. "Rights? You lost those rights when you chose to believe lies over the truth, when you didn't even give me a chance to explain." She took a deep breath. "Now, if you hear about the acquisition offer, my answer is no. My practice isn't for sale." "Lynn, please." Ryan stood, reaching for her hand. I need time to process this, to make things right." "Make things right?" Lynn pulled away. "These aren't quarterly reports you can adjust, Brian. They're children. Our children. And they've been just fine without Sterling Industries in their lives." The sound of children's laughter floated down the hallway. Ryan turned toward it instinctively, his heart aching. "They're so beautiful," he whispered. For a moment, Lynn's expression softened. "Yes, they are. and I've spent 5 years protecting them from the kind of pain I went through. So if you're planning to sweep in with lawyers and custody suits—" "No," Ryan said quickly. "No lawyers, no suits. Just, please, give me a chance to know them, to explain, to try to fix what I destroyed." Lynn looked at him for a long moment, seeing the changes time had carved into his face. The arrogant young CEO was gone, replaced by someone who looked as lost as she'd once been. "I'll think about it," she finally said. "But I make no promises. And if you bring your mother anywhere near my children—" "I haven't spoken to her in 3 years," Ryan interrupted. "Not since I discovered what she did. Not just to you, but to others. I'm not that same foolish man anymore, Lynn." A small face peeked around the corner. "Daniel, the serious one." "Mama? Nurse Jenny says it's time for your medicine." Lynn smiled, her whole face softening. "Thank you, sweetheart. I'll be right there." She turned back to Ryan, her expression guarded again. "Come back tomorrow at 4. The kids have their art class then. We can talk more." As Ryan walked out of the clinic, he heard the Quad's laughter again, his children's laughter. He had a lot to make up for, and even more to prove. But for the first time in 5 years, he felt something he'd thought he'd lost forever: hope. Lynn looked at Ryan's hopeful face. "The kids usually get ice cream at the pier after swimming. If you'd like, you could join us." "Really?" His eyes lit up like a child's. "They need to know the truth eventually," Lynn said softly. "And Michael loves showing off his achievements. Just let them set the pace, okay?" They walked to the pier together, maintaining a careful distance. But something had shifted. The truth was finally out, and old wounds had begun to heal. At the ice cream shop, 4 wet-haired children bounced excitedly as they ordered their favorites. Michael proudly showed off his swimming badge to everyone, including the nice man who brings books. Thomas shared his chocolate sprinkles with Rose, while Daniel studied Ryan with those 2 wise eyes. "You look like us," Daniel said suddenly, making both adults freeze. "Is that why you keep watching us?" Ryan looked at Lynn, who gave a slight nod. "Yes," he answered softly. "That's part of the reason. Would you like to hear the whole story?" 4 pairs of eyes, his eyes in 4 different faces, turned to him expectantly. Lynn squeezed his hand briefly before letting go, and Ryan understood. This wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a beginning. The news broke on a quiet Tuesday morning. Sterling Industries' hair discovers secret family screamed the headlines. Ryan had tried to keep things quiet, but somehow the story leaked. Within hours, reporters swarmed Pine Harbor, camping outside Lynn's clinic and the children's school. "I'll handle this," Ryan promised, seeing Lynn's worried face as they rushed the kids into the clinic's back entrance. He'd already arranged for private security to keep the press at bay, but he knew they needed more than just physical protection. That evening, Ryan called a press conference. Standing before the cameras, he looked nothing like the polished businessman everyone knew. Instead, he spoke from his heart. "5 years ago, I made the biggest mistake of my life," he began. "I trusted the wrong people and lost the love of my life. Today, I discovered I have 4 beautiful children. They're not a scandal. They're not a story. They're my family, and I will protect them with everything I have." Back at the clinic, Lynn watched the broadcast with mixed emotions. The children were coloring in her office, blissfully unaware of the chaos their existence had created. "Mama, look!" Rose held up her drawing, a family of stick figures, now with an extra tall one labeled Dad. "Can we show this to Father when he comes tomorrow?" The past few weeks had been a careful dance. Ryan visited daily, slowly building relationships with each child. He'd discovered Daniel's passion for science and brought him a real microscope. Michael's energy found a perfect outlet in the junior soccer league Ryan helped organize. Thomas lit up when Ryan brought a keyboard and sat patiently through his beginner songs. And Rose, she'd stolen her father's heart completely, sharing his love for building things. The door chimed, and Mrs. Rodriguez bustled in with dinner for everyone. "Those vultures out there better not scare away my customers," she muttered, but her eyes softened seeing the children. "Your papa, he's doing right by you now, mi amors." Ryan arrived later that evening, after handling another round of press. He looked exhausted but brightened seeing his family safe and sound. "Father," Michael ran to him, soccer ball in hand. "Can you practice with me? Please?" "Michael," Lynn started, but Ryan caught her eye. "I'd love to," he said. "But first, I need to talk to your mama about something important." Once the children were occupied with their dinner, Ryan shared his plan. He bought a small house near the clinic with a big yard for the kids to play safely away from prying eyes. He'd also started the process of moving Sterling Industries' West Coast headquarters to Pine Harbor. "I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly, seeing Lynn's expression. "The house is for when I visit the children. And the company move. Well, Pine Harbor could use the jobs, but only if you're comfortable with it." Lynn studied him thoughtfully. "You're really serious about this?" "I've missed 5 years of their lives," Ryan's voice cracked. "I don't want to miss another day. Whatever it takes, however long it takes to prove myself to you and them. I'm here." A crash from the break room interrupted them. Thomas had knocked over his juice, and Michael was trying to help, but making it worse. Rose was giving instructions from her chair, while Daniel already had paper towels in hand. Together, Lynn and Ryan moved to help, working in sync as if they'd done this 1,000 times. As they cleaned up the spill, their hands brushed, and for a moment, the years melted away. "Can we see Father's new house?" Thomas asked, his eyes hopeful. "He said it has a music room." "And a soccer field," Michael added. "It's just a yard," Ryan laughed. "But yes, plenty of space for soccer." Lynn watched her children's excited faces. "Maybe this weekend," she said carefully. "If you all finish your homework and chores." The kids cheered, and Ryan's face lit up with pure joy. It was a small step, but an important one. Later, as Ryan read bedtime stories to the kids at Lynn's apartment, they'd bait him to stay just a bit longer. Lynn overheard Rose ask, "Why didn't you find us sooner, Father?" The room went quiet. Lynn held her breath, but Ryan's answer was honest and gentle. "Because I made a big mistake, sweetheart. I listened to the wrong people instead of my heart. But I promise you, I'll spend the rest of my life making up for that lost time." "Good," Rose said simply, "because I already drew you into all my family pictures." That night, after Ryan left and the children were asleep, Lynn found those pictures. Dozens of them, all showing 6 stick figures now instead of 5. Her heart squeezed remembering the lonely drawings from years past. Change was coming to their little family, ready or not. But watching Ryan with the children, seeing his genuine efforts and remorse, Lynn began to hope that maybe, just maybe, these changes might be for the better. The next morning, she found a familiar paper coffee cup on her desk. Hot chocolate, just like the day they first met. The note simply read, "Thank you for giving me a chance to know them. To know you again. Ah." Lynn smiled, remembering the clumsy young man who'd spilled hot chocolate on her books all those years ago. He was trying so hard to make things right. Maybe it was time she tried too. Autumn painted Pine Harbor in shades of gold and red as life settled into a new rhythm. Ryan's house became a second home for the children, with their own rooms decorated just as they wanted. Daniel's was filled with books and science projects, Michael's with sports equipment, Thomas's with musical instruments, and Rose's with building blocks and drawing supplies. Lynn watched the changes with cautious optimism. Ryan had kept every promise, never pushing for more than she was willing to give. He attended school events, helped with homework, and learned each child's quirks and needs. Most importantly, he listened to their stories, their fears, their dreams. One Saturday morning, while the kids played in the backyard, Lynn found Ryan in his home office, surrounded by papers. He was reviewing medical research grants, she realized, applications for funding from Sterling Industries' new healthcare foundation. "This one," he said, holding up a familiar proposal. "Your research on emotional support for multiple birth families. The board approved full funding." Lynn blinked in surprise. "Ryan, I didn't submit that for funding." "Mrs. Rodriguez did," he admitted. "She said you were too proud to ask." "Lynn, your work is important. It shouldn't be held back because of our past." Before she could respond, Michael burst in, tears streaming down his face. "Mama, Father, Thomas won't get up." They ran to the yard where Thomas lay pale and shaking, his temperature soaring. Within minutes, they were racing to the hospital, the other children huddled together in the back seat of Ryan's car. The next 12 hours tested them all. Thomas had developed a severe infection, his small body fighting hard. Lynn switched between doctor and mother mode, reviewing charts and holding her son's hand. Ryan never left their side, comforting the other children and supporting Lynn without hesitation. "He's going to be okay, right?" Rose whispered, curled up in Ryan's lap. "He has to be okay." "Your brother is strong," Ryan assured her, his voice rough with emotion. "Just like your ma. And we're all here for him." Late that night, with Thomas finally stable and sleeping, Lynn found herself alone with Ryan in the hospital corridor. Without thinking, she leaned into him, exhausted and relieved. His arms went around her naturally, offering the comfort she didn't realize she needed. "I was so scared," she whispered against his shirt. "Me too," he admitted, "but you were amazing. You've always been amazing, raising them alone all these years." Lynn pulled back slightly, looking up at him. "I wasn't completely alone. I had help." "But you should have had me," his voice cracked. "Every sleepless night, every fever, every first step, I should have been there." "You're here now," she said softly. "That's what matters to them." The next few days brought more changes. Ryan worked from Thomas's hospital room, his laptop balanced on his knees as he made calls and sent emails. The other children stayed close, doing their homework and playing quiet games. The nurses smiled at this unusual family, commenting on how the little patient had both his parents' determination. One evening, as Thomas was recovering, Daniel looked up from his book. "Are you and Father going to get married?" he asked Lynn bluntly. Ryan choked on his coffee. Lynn froze mid-sentence in her patient notes. "Because logically," Daniel continued in his serious way, "we already live in 2 houses. It would be more efficient to live in one. And Father looks at you the same way Mr. Rodriguez looks at Mrs. Rodriguez." "Yeah," Michael chimed in. "And then Father can make us pancakes every morning instead of just weekends. I could play piano for the wedding," Thomas offered weakly from his bed, making everyone laugh. "I already designed the house," Rose announced, pulling out her ever-present sketchbook. "See? One big house for all of us, with a laboratory for Daniel, a music room for Thomas, a gym for Michael, and an art studio for me." Lynn and Ryan exchanged glances over their children's heads. Something had shifted during this crisis, bringing them closer than they'd been since those early dating days. That night, after the children were asleep, Thomas in his hospital bed, the others on cots nearby, Ryan and Lynn walked to the hospital cafeteria for coffee. "They're not wrong, you know," Ryan said quietly, "about how I look at you." Lynn stirred her coffee slowly. "I know. I'm not the same person I was 5 years ago." "Neither am I," he replied. "But maybe that's good. Maybe we needed to grow into the people we are now, people who put family first, who fight for what matters." "Is that what you're doing? Fighting for what matters?" Ryan reached across the table, taking her hand. "Every day. For them. For you. For us, if you'll let there be an us again." Lynn looked at their joined hands, remembering all the pain and loneliness, but also seeing all the joy and love that had come from it, their 4 beautiful children, the life she built, the man Ryan had become. "We'll need to take it slow," she said finally. "The children come first." Ryan's smile could have lit up the whole hospital. "Always. We'll take all the time you need." After all, he squeezed her hand gently. "I'm not going anywhere this time." As they walked back to Thomas's room, Lynn felt something she hadn't in years, the feeling of her heart truly healing, making space for a love that was older but wiser, stronger for having been broken and rebuilt. The sight that greeted them made them both stop and smile. All 4 children had squeezed onto Thomas's bed, sound asleep in a tangle of limbs and blankets. Their family might not look like the one Lynn had dreamed of as a young medical student, but maybe it was even better, tested by time, strengthened by challenges, and bound together by a love that had survived against all odds. Spring bloomed in Pine Harbor, bringing with it new beginnings. The small gazebo by the beach was decorated with wildflowers and twinkling lights. 5 years after their unexpected reunion, Lynn and Ryan were finally getting married, this time with 4 excited wedding planners in charge. "Mama, hold still." Rose fussed with Lynn's simple white dress. At 10 years old, she'd appointed herself the official wedding coordinator, complete with a clipboard and checklist. "The flowers are all set," Daniel reported, walking in with his tablet. He'd created a detailed spreadsheet for the ceremony timing. "And Father is already at the gazebo. He's pacing." Lynn smiled, remembering another nervous Ryan from years ago. So much had changed, yet some things remained perfectly the same. "Thomas is ready with the music," Michael added, bouncing on his toes. He was wearing a suit but had somehow convinced them to let him keep his lucky soccer socks on underneath. "Can we do the thing now, Mama? Please?" Lynn nodded, and the children gathered around her. It had become their tradition over the past year. A quiet moment just for them before any big event. "No matter what," they said together, holding hands, "we're a family. Yesterday, today, and always." The ceremony was everything they'd wanted, small, intimate, and filled with love. Thomas played the piano while Rose walked down the aisle first, sprinkling flannel petals. Michael and Daniel followed, carrying the rings they'd helped design. Ryan's eyes filled with tears when he saw Lynn walking toward him, their children beaming beside her. Mrs. Rodriguez, sitting in the front row, dabbed at her eyes with her apron. 5 years ago, Ryan began his vows, his voice steady despite his emotions. "I got a second chance at love, at family, at life itself. You and our children taught me what really matters. Today, I promise to spend the rest of my life showing you how thankful I am for that gift." Lynn squeezed his hands. "When I came to Pine Harbor, I thought I was running away. Instead, I found a home, a community, and the strength to build a life I love. Our children are that love made real. And you proved that sometimes the best endings come from difficult beginnings. Does this mean we can officially live in the big house now?" Michael interrupted, making everyone laugh. The big house had been Rose's design brought to life, a home that perfectly blended their family's needs. Ryan had worked with architects to turn her crayon drawings into reality, creating a space where everyone could thrive. The reception was held in their new backyard. Lanterns hung from trees, and tables were scattered across the lawn. Thomas played a song he composed for the occasion, while Michael challenged the guests to soccer matches. Daniel gave a surprisingly witty toast, and Rose cried happy tears over the cake she'd helped design. Later that evening, as their friends and family celebrated around them, Lynn and Ryan swayed to the music on their new back porch. "Happy?" Ryan asked softly. "More than I ever imagined possible," Lynn replied, watching their children play with their friends. "Though I think we might need to add another bedroom soon." Ryan missed a step. "What?" Lynn smiled. "Daniel figured it out first, of course. He noticed I've been tired lately, craving the same foods I did last time." "Last time?" Ryan's eyes widened. "You mean?" "Just one this time," Lynn laughed. "I had an ultrasound yesterday to confirm." Ryan pulled her close, his hand resting protectively over her stomach. "I get to be here for everything," he whispered. "Every craving, every kick, every moment." "We all do." Rose's voice made them turn. All 4 children stood there grinning. "I knew it." Daniel looked proud of his detective work. "Can I teach the baby soccer?" Michael asked hopefully. "I'll write a special song," Thomas promised. "And I'll design the nursery." Rose was already pulling out her sketchbook. Lynn and Ryan shared a look of pure joy. This was their miracle, not just the new life growing, but these amazing children who'd brought them back together, who'd taught them how to love better, stronger, wiser. That night, after the guests had gone and the children were asleep in their new rooms, Lynn and Ryan stood in their backyard under the stars. "You know," Lynn said thoughtfully, "when I left New York, I thought my heart was broken beyond repair. But looking back, it was just making space for something bigger. A love big enough for 4 miracle babies, a whole coastal town of friends, and a man who learned to fight for his family." Ryan kissed her softly. "And now we're making space for one more miracle." Inside, they could see the children's rooms, Daniel's lamp still on as he read, Michael's sports posters catching the moonlight, Thomas's keyboard waiting for morning practice, Rose's artwork decorating every wall. Soon, a new room would join them, filled with new dreams and possibilities. Their family story hadn't followed any normal path. There had been tears and doubts, struggles and fears. But standing there, wrapped in each other's arms, with 5 hearts beating beneath their roof and one more on the way, they knew every step had led them exactly where they were meant to be. After all, the best love stories aren't about perfect beginnings. They're about hearts that are brave enough to try again, souls that recognize each other even after years apart, and the kind of love that builds homes out of broken pieces and makes families out of second chances.